Welcome back in our next lecture of public finance. So in the last lecture we discussed about the insolvency and the bankruptcy code 2016, under which we discussed the new institutional framework, like there will be a regulator that is going to regulate it. Then there will be insolvency professional agents, then there will be agency, professional agencies will be there, and there will be information utilities. Then there will be adjudicating bodies, two different adjudicating bodies, one for the companies, that is National Law Company Tribunal, and then there will be for the individuals or the unlimited liability partnership. For that, for these two types of individuals, there will be debt recovery tribunal. So all these things we discussed. So under the reforms part of public finance, next in this lecture we are going to cover two major committees. The first one is the Raja Chelliah committee, which came in 1991. All the few more recommendations came in 92 and 93 also. And the second one is, this is highly relevant from exam perspective. The second one is the FRBM, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003. In this year budget 2016-17 also, there are two or three major suggestions under this budget, and accordingly a committee has already been set up to make some changes or to change the features of the FRBM Act. So first we will cover the Raja Chelliah committee. So before coming to the recommendations of Raja Chelliah committee, first we will discuss the evolution of the Indian economy during 60s, 70s, and what were the situation during which this Raja Chelliah committee was set up, and the committee gave the recommendations. So we discussed the progressive taxes. Under types of taxes, we discussed something known as a progressive tax. The progressive tax means when your income increases, the tax liability increases. If this is the tax rate, so when your income increases, the tax rate increases. But we also discussed the Laffey curve. Under that Laffey curve, sorry. So according to this Laffey curve, it says that up to a certain percentage, if the tax rate is optimal, we can say 30%, 35% or 40%. If it is optimal, then only your tax revenue will be maximum. If it is less than optimal or if it is more than the optimal, your tax revenue is going to decrease. If it is less than this, suppose this is the optimal tax rate. If it is less than this, then also your tax revenue is less, and if it is more than this, then also your tax revenue is less. During 1960s and 70s, the progressiveness in the direct taxes, we will divide these things into direct and indirect taxes. So during 60s and 70s, there was a lot of reforms under the progressiveness of the direct taxes. The tax rate was as high as 90%. For the very highest strata of the society, it was as high as 90%. And whenever the tax rate will be very high, people will try to evade the taxes, because according to the cost benefit analysis, they will assume that if I will hide the taxes, that will be more beneficial to me. So people started evading the taxes, and the collection efficiency of the government, it decreased. Why the tax collection efficiency decreased? Because the tax rate was very high, and there was very poor enforcement, because there can be a number of reasons. People, they themselves started paying the taxes, or there was some collusion between the income tax personals and these very rich people. Then in case of the second, this was related to personal income tax. In case of corporate income tax also, there were a number of companies, different sectors were there, and sector specific government was giving some incentive. So there was a lot of discrimination in case of corporate income tax also. And whenever there is a discrimination, it means there is discretionary power, and whenever there is discretionary power, then investment is going to decrease. The milau, the environment, the financial environment of the country, it started deteriorating, and when that environment started deteriorating, the investment started decreasing. Now in case of indirect taxes, the tax rate, indirect taxes, for example, we have custom, we have excise. At that time there was no service tax. So there was very high custom duties and excise duties. During 60s and 70s, there was no VAT, value added tax. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss VAT and GST. So there was no value added tax. A lot of tax evasion was taking place. Then there was reforms. These 2 points you will be able to appreciate once we will cover the VAT and GST. Then there were some major reforms during 1990s. One reform was this long-term fiscal policy came in 1985. And accordingly, when this policy came, then on the recommendations of, there was a famous committee, L.K. Jha committee. On the recommendations of L.K. Jha committee, this mod VAT was regarded as one of the most important reform in the financial sector of India till 1986. So mod VAT came in 1986. What was there in mod VAT? We'll cover in the next lecture. So during all this background, with this background, this Raja Chelliah committee was set up, and in 1991, the Raja Chelliah committee gave few recommendations. So the first recommendation given by Raja Chelliah committee was reform the personal income tax, decrease the tax rates as well as the slab, the number of slab. It is like at present we have only 3 slabs. 3 slab means less than 2.5 lakh, no tax. 2.5 to 5 lakh, 10%. 5 to 10 lakh, 20%. And more than 10 lakh, it is 30%. So for payment of tax, we have only 3 slabs. Earlier, there were 14 or 15 slabs. If your income is less than 10,000, if it is less than 20,000, 20,000 to 30,000, 30,000 to 40,000. So the number of tax slabs, they were much more, as well as the tax, the value of the tax, it was very high. So the committee recommended there should be some reforms in the personal income tax. The number of slabs should be decreased, as well as the rate of personal income tax should be decreased. Then the second recommendation was decrease the corporate income tax. The value of corporate income tax was as high as 97%. Think, if somebody is earning, if your profit is 100 rupees and you have started a company, of course, if your turnover is more than this and that, that was the criteria, then you have to pay 97 rupees to the government. Which business organization or which company then want to set up their business in India? Obviously, no company. So the committee recommended, after that, LPG reforms. We'll cover LPG reforms in some other unit. So that liberalization, privatization and globalization reforms of 1991, after this we reformed this corporate income tax and all those things, and finally the investment in India started improving. Then the committee recommended there should be some presumptive tax. You know, we discussed tax evasion and tax avoidance. So we discussed avoidance is legal by using the legal loophole if a company or individual is decreasing the tax liability. And in case of tax evasion, it is illegal. By illegal means, you are decreasing your tax liability. So this committee said there should be presumptive tax, like MAT, minimum alternate tax. The details of MAT we already covered under the taxation chapter. So MAT is, if your book profit is something and your tax liability is less than something, then you have to pay 18.5%. This is what the present value of minimum alternate tax, which started from 1996-97. This committee only recommended there should be presumptive tax like MAT. Then the committee also recommended there should be a need of service tax in India. And finally, the service tax also we covered. Service tax came in India from 93-94. From how many services? It started with 3 services: telecommunication, then insurance and the share market. And right now, for how many services we have service tax? Option 10, 20, 30, 40, and the answer is none of the above, because right now we have a negative concept in case of service tax. Then the next recommendation was ad valorem taxes. So rather than having specific taxes, under types of taxes we discussed what is specific tax, what is ad valorem tax. So earlier we had specific tax. Whatever is the value of output, the tax was fixed. Rather than such system, the tax should be dependent on the value of output. Suppose think about the situation. If this is a restaurant and you went, this is restaurant maybe, or maybe hotel, this is 2-star hotel and this is 5-star hotel. When you are visiting this 2-star hotel and if your bill is for example 5,000 rupees, and when you are visiting 5-star, if your bill is 50,000 rupees, had there been a fixed taxation, so the tax on 5,000 as well as 50,000 would have same. It means, so for example the tax is 500 rupees plus it is 500 rupees. Rather than having this system, this tax should be dependent on the value of output. Suppose it is 10%. So in this case 10% of 5,000 is 500, but 10% of 50,000 is 5,000. So it should be the percentage wise. So earlier we had the specific tax, right now we have ad valorem tax. Still we have specific tax for petroleum and all. We discussed these things. Then they discussed that broaden the tax base. Look, the government wants, any successful government wants to improve the tax collection, because when the tax collection will be high, if the coffins of the government, they are big, they are huge. If the tax collection of the government is more, then only the government can do the expenditure. But from where the government can collect the taxes? There will be some tax base, people who are paying the taxes or the companies who are paying the taxes. If your tax base is narrow, not much people are paying the tax, then the only option is you have to increase the tax rate. Whoever is paying, force them to pay more to you. If this is government, the government can force, rather than having 10% tax rate, they can say you have to pay 30% tax rate. But we also discussed LAFICA. So under LAFICA, if the tax rate is very high, the tax revenue is going to decrease. So the suggestion was improve it. It should not be like only these people are paying the taxes. Include all these other people also to pay the taxes. Now how to broaden the tax base is, you can decrease the tax rate. Suppose right now we have up to 2.5 lakh rupees. What the government can do, make it 1.5 lakh. This is not what I am suggesting, but this is one option. The second option is, make your tax collection efficient. At present, can you tell me what is the percentage of the people which pay tax in India? What percentage of Indian population pays tax? Option is 5%, 10%, 15% and 20%. The answer is less than 5%. Not even 5% population of India pays the tax. So you have to improve this tax base. The next recommendation was decrease the custom duties, the excise duties. Then this committee also recommended that decrease the number of excise duty and increase the number of mod VAT. This we will discuss in the VAT. Then the second reform that is more relevant from exam perspective is, why I discuss this Chelliah committee, because maybe they can ask that MAT was started on the recommendation of which committee, or service tax was started on the recommendation of which committee. Then they can also ask the specific tax to ad valorem tax and all these things. So because of that only we discussed that Chelliah committee recommendations. Then the second one is the FRBM Act 2003. Again, first we will discuss the historical perspective, why this FRBM Act came, what was the need of FRBM Act. So the thing is, before 1990s, all of us know the financial health of the government was not good. We were forced, India was forced to go to IMF to get some dollars, and they gave us $2 billion loan. Anyways, we'll discuss that thing later. But the financial health of the government was not good during 1990s and even 1980s. So after LPG reforms, government started increasing the expenditure on health, defense and all these things. And when the expenditure on these things increases, the fiscal deficit of the government increase, because the government was forced to borrow. Then the borrowing of the government, it increased. And when you are borrowing, you have to repay. Maybe after 15 years, 20 years, you have to repay. But every year you have to pay interest. So because of huge fiscal deficit during 1990s, government started borrowing. Earlier the government had one more option, that was printing of currency. But after 1991, no printing of currency, the only option was to borrow. And the fiscal deficit was very high. So the government borrowing increased exponentially. And when the borrowings increase exponentially, the interest burden it increased exponentially. But here it is a problem. The problem is, we will discuss under that, intergenerational equity. The feature, one of the major feature of FRBM was it introduced the intergenerational equity, which says that if the present generation is borrowing, suppose in 1990s the government borrowed, so the use of the funds, this whatever fund that was available, that was used by the generation of 1990s. But the present generation of 2015, they have to repay the interest. And this is the reason, the huge borrowing of government during 1990s is the reason that the maximum revenue expenditure that we discussed in the structure of the budget, the maximum revenue expenditure by the union government is under the head of interest payment. Every year the government is paying 4.5 lakh crore only for the interest. This is a huge amount. This interest, the second sector, the second item on which this expenditure is known as subsidy, which is roughly 2.5 lakh crore. So more than the subsidy to the poor, the government is forced to return the interest which the previous generation borrowed. So FRBM Act is an initiative or a step towards intergenerational equity, because right now it is not the intergenerational equity. The present generation borrowed and the future generation, the burden of that present borrowing is on the future generation. But if the present borrowing will be decreased, so there will be equity between these two generations. So this is known as the intergenerational equity. And also, because of the increased borrowing, the government came up with this FRBM Act 2003, under which the targets, the fiscal deficit targets, then the revenue deficits, they were decreased exponentially. And the government forced itself to fulfill these targets. Then the FRBM Act, it improved the fiscal discipline. Whatever was mentioned in that particular FRBM Act, we will discuss under features. So government was forced to accept it, and there was the fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation means decreasing the expenditure of the government. We discussed these definitions. So fiscal consolidation is nothing but the decreasing the expenditure or rationalizing the expenditure. Then we discussed what was the need. The government borrowing increased, which increased the interest, and the financial health deteriorated. And when the financial health deteriorated, the government was forced to come up with the FRBM Act 2003. And then what were the features? What was mentioned in the FRBM Act? So there were few targets, just like fiscal deficit. In 2003 they said, and that the revenue deficit. We discussed revenue deficit is the worst type of deficit, because under revenue deficit either my assets are decreasing or my liability is increasing, and both these things, they are worst for any economy. The fiscal deficit target, which was supposed to be achieved by 2008-9, it was 3%, and revenue deficit, of course, it should be 0%. So this was the target for fiscal deficit and revenue deficit. But there were exceptions. The union government was allowed to do to violate these targets intentionally if there is some natural calamity. For example, if the tsunami came in 2004 and government was forced to increase the expenditure, so in such circumstances the government was allowed to increase their or to intentionally violate their fiscal targets. Then the second feature, this was the first feature, the second feature was the government will not borrow from RBI. We discussed monetized deficit. The concept of budget deficit and monetized deficit, it has stopped now. After FRBM Act, there was no borrowing from Government of India from the RBI. So that was mentioned under FRBM Act 2003. So this was the second feature of FRBM Act. The third feature was there should be coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy. It is like if RBI wants to decrease the money supply, but Government of India, or we can say the fiscal policy, maybe for whatsoever reason, election, whatever the political reasons government is having, and they want to increase the money supply. So this is going to be bad for the economy. So there should be a coordination between the monetary policy and fiscal policy. The next feature was there should be transparency, how the government is working, from where the government is borrowing, to whom the government is lending. All this should be done in a transparent manner. Then there should be long-term macroeconomic stability. Long-term macroeconomic stability. So government should work toward, it should move towards, the policies of the government should be like this, that government has to fulfill this long-term macroeconomic stability. It is possible that because of recession in Europe or recession in the down of economic growth in China or Japan, it may somehow impact India, but there should be long-term macroeconomic stability, and the government should work towards this long-term macroeconomic stability, and the government should give a target for 3 years. Every year target will come in budget, but in budget itself there will be a new statement which is long-term macroeconomic stability. So the policy for next 3 years will be mentioned in the budget itself. Just like we have 5-year plans. So under that 5-year plans, what will be the policy of the government will be enumerated by the government in these 5-year plans, and then we have annual budget. So maybe if there are some changes, then that will be decided in the annual budget. So overall 5-year plan will be like this, and every year there will be budget. Similarly, in the budget, the government will come up that this will be my broad policy for the financial policy for the next 3 years. And then the next feature was, one of the major objective of FRBM Act was to implement the intergenerational equity. And how to implement this intergenerational equity? By making a drastic cut in the fiscal deficit and the revenue deficit. It's not like the present fiscal deficit is 8%, 10% or something, because the future generation has to repay that amount. Then there were 2 major amendments in FRBM Act. One was there during recession in 2007-8 itself. We discussed the target by 2008-9 was 3% for fiscal deficit, and for revenue deficit it was 0. But government intentionally violated the target. And what was the reason? The reason was recession. And I think we also discussed what is recession and all these things in detail. We will discuss in the global financial crisis unit. But the reason of recession, or how to overcome recession, the government has to increase the expenditure. When the government will increase the expenditure, the purchasing power of the economy is going to increase. And when their purchasing power is going to increase, the demand of the commodities is going to increase. And when the demand is going to increase, demand will become more than supply. Because the reason of recession is when supply is more than demand. When supply will be more than demand, the companies will decrease their output. And when the companies will decrease their output, they will start sacking. and when they will start sacking the employees, that is going to decrease the demand or the purchasing power. And what is the solution? This is the solution. The government should intervene and government should increase the demand or the purchasing power of the economy. When their demand or purchasing power will be increased, then demand is going to increase. Finally, the demand will become more than supply. So intentionally the government violated it, and through a number of schemes like MG, Narega and all by increasing the targets of the bank to land in the rural areas. So after all these things, using all these steps, in case of USA it was quantitative easing, in case of China also it was the investment based model. So different economy uses different models to increase the expenditure. So government intentionally violated it in 2008-9. Then in 2012 and in 2015 also the government amended it, and that MTEF medium term expenditure framework statement, it came in 2012 only. Then in this year budget 2016-17 the government said we are going to set up a committee, and this committee is going to recommend what are the required amendments in FRBM Act. You know, we discussed Urjit Patel committee, that is related to monetary policy, inflation. This Urjit Patel committee recommended that rather than having a fixed target of inflation, there should be a range of inflation, and that range was 4 plus minus 2%. It means 2% to 6% is the window. Similarly, now few economists, they are saying rather than having a fixed target for revenue deficit as 3%, there should be a window for this. And one of the objective of this committee is to give the recommendations whether there should be a fixed revenue deficit target or there should be a window of plus minus. It can be 2% to 5%, 1% to 6%, whatever that window is. Either we need a fixed target or a window, because if you have a window, for example, the window is 2% to 6%. It's just an example. In the case of recession, when the government will increase the expenditure intentionally at that time, even if your revenue it's not revenue deficit, sorry, it's fiscal deficit. If your fiscal deficit becomes 6%, still the government is not violating in case of recession. And when the economy is doing good, at that time the tax collection of the government will be good, so the government will not involve in fiscal deficit. So when the economy will do good, at that time the fiscal deficit target will be achieved. When there is recession, still the target is being achieved, because if the government will regularly and intentionally violate these targets, the trust on this FRBM Act, the trust of the Indian investors as well as the outside investors, that is going to decrease, because the government itself created this act and the government, as per the discretion of the government, is violating it. Then what is the need of FRBM Act? Avoid it, remove it. So rather than having a fixed target, there should be a range. This is one of the objective of this committee. And the second objective is very interesting. You know, the thing is, this is suppose economy, and if there is a growth, to fulfill this growth you need funds, you need investment. If the growth is good, so companies have to increase their expenditure, and to increase their expenditure they have to expand their business. To expand their business they need funds. So from where the companies, the individuals, they will get the funds? Two options. First option is banks. From banks they can take a loan, and the second option is Government of India. Government of India may be using a number of schemes, just like MG Narega, the government is paying 40,000 crore annually, or other social benefit programs of Government of India. It is not only for the individuals, it is also for the companies also, just like in case of that recent startup scheme in which you don't have to pay tax, or your tax liability is 25% rather than 30%. So all these are the incentives, the money given by the government. So these are the two institutions from where this economy will get the funds. If you are saying that government is going to decrease the fiscal deficit, it means the money coming from this route is going to decrease. So this will decrease. If there is growth in the economy, so to fulfill the growth you need money. If your this channel is decreasing, so the money coming from this channel should increase. But if suppose the money that comes from this channel, it is known as credit expansion. If there is no credit expansion, the reason can be different. The reason can be you have to maintain SLR, you have to maintain CRR. SLR is 21.5%, CRR is 4%. So roughly 25% the banks are forced to maintain with themselves. That is only in India. In case of other economies, the value of CRR, SLR is not that high. So if the credit expansion is also decreasing and you are forcing the government to fulfill the target of fiscal deficit as 3%, so it means this channel is also decreasing. If the money which flows through both these channels will decrease, so finally there will not be enough money in the economy to fulfill or to match the growth expectations. And when this is going to happen, it may leads to recession. Let's put all these discussions in nutshell. If suppose one company is there and the expectation of the company is that there is a demand of my products, so the company wants to increase the supply of these things. To increase the supply, they have to expand the business. To expand the business, they need money. From where the money will come? Either through this or through this. If through this channel, if you are saying your fiscal deficit should be 3%, 3%, 3%, so it means the government will not give you enough money. On the other hand, in case of these banks, again if the targets are like SLR, CRR and all is very high, so the availability of the money through this channel also is not enough. So money supply from both these channels will be not enough or will not match the growth expectations. And when that is going to come, that company will not do the expansion of the business, and when no expansion of the business, they will decrease recruitment or they will increase the sacking, and finally that may lead to recession. So it is a very new thought. It's a very new concept. These two concepts are very new. First one is rather than having a fixed value, there should be a window. And the second one is the fiscal deficit should be related to the credit expansion of the economy. Then there is two more amendments. First one is the 14th Finance Commission. So in the month of April 2016, the cabinet passed one resolution under which one of the recommendation of the 14th Finance Commission, that is related to this, that is related to the states. The 14th Finance Commission recommended that states borrowing should be less than 25% of GDP, and their fiscal deficit target, it should be 3%. But there are two exceptions. It means this 3% can become 3.5% if, first condition is, if there is no revenue deficit for this year. If the revenue deficit for any year is 0, if suppose 2016-17 we are talking, if there is no revenue deficit in 2016-17, then you have to again fulfill two conditions. So the primary condition is this. If you are fulfilling this, then one condition is if interest upon revenue receipt is less than 10%. If it is there, then you can borrow extra 0.25%. This is one condition. The second one is if your debt upon GSDP, gross state domestic product, we are talking about states here. If debt upon GSDP is less than 25%, so again you can extra borrow 0.25%. It means 0.25 plus 0.25.5. So this 3% can be 3.5% if the state is fulfilling these two conditions and this condition. So the primary condition is revenue deficit should be 0. If revenue deficit is 0, then only these two conditions come into picture. If your interest upon revenue receipt is less than 10%, you can extra borrow 0.25%. Also, if your debt to GSDP is less than 25%, you can also extra borrow 0.25%. So these are the two conditions. Now because it's a very recent news, so can be asked in the exam, can be asked in pre this year, or it can be asked in SSC also, which is I think in August last week most probably. So the 14th Finance Commission recommendation which is related to this, it has been accepted by the Union Cabinet. Then the last one is the Uday scheme, the Ujjwal Yojana, that is related to, in detail we are going to discuss in the economic survey chapter, but that is related to the, we have the electricity discom, the distributors of electricity. So if it is a government distributor, so whatever your loss, 50% of your debt, we can say debt, not loss, 50% of your debt will be taken by the government, 50 plus 25% of the debt in the next year. So whatever the state government they are borrowing, whatever the debt, the total loss of these discoms, they will be converted, they will be shifted to the state government. And when this debt becomes the debt of the state government, then the fiscal deficit of the government will increase, of course. But if you are implementing the Uday scheme, and because of Uday scheme your fiscal deficit is increasing, that will not be counted under that FRBM Act. In detail we will discuss under that economic survey chapter. But for now on, if a state is implementing the Uday scheme and because of this they are violating the fiscal deficit target of 3%, then that extra will not be counted under this FRBM Act. And then we will do the critical analysis of FRBM Act. We discuss the credit expansion. The credit expansion should be related to this. One very good figure is, you know the total GDP of the world. The GDP of world is slightly more than $60 trillion. You know the availability of currency across the world, it is $7 trillion. That's it. And you know this $7 trillion, they are being converted into $700 trillion. It means the money multiplier that we discussed, its value is 100. But in case of India, it is 5.5. What is the reason? The reason is Indian banks are highly regulated. 21.5% you have to keep as SLR. Then 4% you have to keep as CRR. If this much amount of money banks have to keep with themselves, how can they do the credit creation? So the money multiplier value is less. The world average is 100 and Indian average is this. The reason is this only. So it has decreased the credit expansion of India, and the credit expansion of India has decreased during last 2 years. So this is decreasing, as well as you are decreasing the fiscal deficit, or you are forcing the government to maintain this fiscal deficit. The resultant and the consequences, it may impact our growth, and when our growth will be impacted, that may lead to recession. And the second one is the crowding out. So the crowding out effect also we discussed. I think I gave one example. If this is there 700 rupees with the private sector, 400 rupees with the 300 rupees with the public sector, and then we discuss the price of the pen. So if you will not force the government to implement this fiscal deficit, the government borrowings will increase, and when the government borrowings will increase, it may crowd out the private sector. I think we have already covered this crowding out effect. So this is what we have, the two reforms, that is the Chelliah committee as well as the FRBM Act. In the next reforms, we will discuss about VAT, value added tax, its evolution, and then we will discuss the most relevant topic from exam perspective, that is the GST, goods and services tax. Thanks a lot.